Hello, I'm Claire Poole and welcome to the Climate of Sport podcast, the show in which you get the inside track on all things sport and sustainability globally. Join me every week where I'll be chatting to a special guest about news, opinion and insights on how sport is moving to a more environmentally friendly future or taking action on climate change. Hi everyone and welcome to this week's episode of the Climate of Sport podcast. I am delighted to be joined this week by one of my favourite people, Lindita Xhaferi-Salihu, who is Sectors Engagement Lead at UNFCCC. Hi Lindita.
Hi Claire. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's so good to see you and hear you and have a catch up. And I'm excited for you to be on the podcast. So thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.
I think a lot of people who listen to the podcast, I'm sure, are aware of the Sports for Climate Action framework and probably have heard you maybe speak at some events or been in meetings with you. But what I think I want to start off with is just asking you a little bit about your background for people who don't know, in terms of your journey, where you've come from and where you're coming through with this work now.
Thank you, Claire. Thanks so much again for having me. It's a great pleasure to be with you, like always. So, maybe I can start with a bit of a personal kind of story here. I come from parents with background in engineering and architecture. So growing up, there was a lot of, solving problems and fixing things and building things in our family, but also very conscious of the social and environmental challenges that existed at that time. So there was a lot of, work in the nature, a lot of, I remember spending lots of weekends in remote villages with my parents, also supporting families in need and, helping with medicine and food and housing. So the sense of public service has been very much ingrained in my DNA, as well as the love for nature. But of course, there was also a lot of football watching in my family. And I think the saying of Bill Shankly that, football is not a matter of life and death, it's much more important than that, was pretty much true in my surroundings and still is. I mean, you should have heard some of the reactions from my family when the stadiums were closed due to the pandemic and there was no matches. Brutal.
Up in arms.
Totally brutal. But to go back to your questions, I serve at the UNFCCC, which I believe is an organization that needs no introduction. It's got an important and very powerful purpose and mission. And of course, as the guardian of the Paris Agreement, our core work is centered around supporting governments mainly, but we also do work with coalitions of cities and regions and businesses seeking to really define a common narrative on climate action that is anchored on science.
Amazing. It's such important work, and it's incredible to have you here talking about it. And I think what I'd love to know as well and share with people who are listening is your role at UNFCCC, because I think some people who work with you and hear you speak kind of see you as obviously, quite rightly, the sectoral engagement lead for sport at UNFCCC, but your role is much bigger than that. And I think it's good. It'd be great to hear a little bit more about your role, yes, doing that work, but also what else you do as well within the Secretariat.
Well, I should say that I love working with sports, but let's not tell anybody else that. I think my role within UNFCCC has really changed a couple of times. I started off with assessing low carbon projects and management support, and then moved to more stakeholder engagement arena to really come up with ideas to mobilize a broader area of stakeholders in climate action. So I currently lead engagement of industry sectors, notably, of course, Sports for Climate Action, as well as a Fashion Industry Charter for Climate Action. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's a number of committees that I lead and co-chair and supervise as well in this work. A lot of the work that we do, as everybody will know, culminates at climate conferences or COPs, where a lot of us follow, of course, particular agenda items and support negotiations as needed.
Yeah, amazing. It's so much going on. I think there's such a huge amount of work that you oversee in different areas. A very busy woman around all of this. And I've had the pleasure of knowing you since I think early 2017, where we first, probably end of 2016, early 2017, where we met, where you attended some meetings that I was hosting around sport, and we were talking about the sectoral engagement possibility of sport, which feels like a million years ago now, but actually whatever, 5-6 years ago. But tell us, in your words, kind of the story around Sports for Climate Action framework as we know it now, where that began, how things got started for you, and how it's progressed from back in those heady days of 2017.
Yes. So I guess, Claire, you know this story very well, because I can remember very clearly when you called me one day and you asked, so what is UNFCCC doing about sports? And that was basically how we started this journey, to think about, well, we have a great opportunity here to work with sports and use our platforms to mobilize society at large on climate action. And so our first kind of step was to convene a number of sports organizations in Bonn to talk about whether sports could use their microphones to speak about climate to their fans and to their, obviously, athletes, but broader community as well. And I think one thing that came out very clearly back then was that sports would not be comfortable going out and talking about climate action without putting their house in order. And this is how Sports for Climate Action was born, really, where we continued these conversations with a number of stakeholders to say what could work. Is there, one size fits all solution, which there isn't? What can we do to translate the goals of the Paris Agreement into some of the concrete actions or areas of work that sports can look into? And maybe the idea back then was really to allow for a lot of flexibility, and I think that we are still doing that in a way, but giving organizations opportunity to they themselves create their plans, but building on a number of principles that they themselves agreed to, which is, looking at embedding environmental considerations in their business models, creating their climate neutrality plans, basically understanding where their emissions come from, what are some of the opportunities to reduce or avoid those, can unavoidable emissions be offset? Is there a way that we can have a system to report publicly on these emissions and what they are and so on? But also looking at things that are kind of more directed towards collaboration, things like promoting sustainable consumption, things like educating for climate, things like communicating about climate. So I think there's basically two aspects there. So one is to really look inwardly and see what can you do to address environmental footprint, but at the same time, what can you do as an organization to influence others and work collaboratively with others? And that is what the framework is really about. But as the time went on, as you know, we've had a lot of discussions within the working groups that are convened. And of course, you are co-chairing one of the working groups with a lot of other great colleagues coming from the sport world. I think the idea was there to move from those kind of broader intentions to some concrete targets and goals and so on. And that's where we are now.
Yes. And that's it. I think, obviously, which we can talk about as well, the targets were put in place last year at COP in Glasgow, etc. And I think it's important as well to note, because I think that there was a lot of feedback from the wider, not just sports, but the wider community of like, what, before that was announced, has this framework got teeth? What's happening with this? There isn't, how much are really sports doing, etc. But when I think back to that original meeting in Bonn in 2017, if in that discussion, we had the conversation like, well, we'd like to put in 50% reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2040. Sport, even 5 years ago, was at a very different phase, wasn't it, with this stuff? And even now we're seeing these commitments being made, which is incredible. But I think even just that snapshot of those 5 years of the drop of how much, I think it gives pause for thought in terms of how much we've evolved and moved on and progressed since then as well.
True, absolutely. I fully agree with that. But also the world has changed, right? Dramatically. Yeah. I mean, I think back then it was really hard to understand what is the right thing and the right approach and what could be some of the right targets. And of course, a lot of the literature and tools out there were very much suited for big companies,
Yes.
Not so much for sports. And so I think now we're starting to build that somehow, not just within Sports for Climate Action Framework, but there's lots of things happening outside as well. Lots of great tools and guidances and reports that are out there. Of course, there's lots of lessons learned from sports organizations that have already started on this journey. They've learned lessons. They know what works, what doesn't work. So there is a way for them to really share that as well with people. I think one thing about climate and climate action is that you need to start thinking long term now, which has not always been the case, right? Because even if you want to switch to another technology or whatever it is, you really need to do a lot of work to understand whether that switching is proper, is right, is going to get us to where we need to be 10 years from now and 20 years from now, right? Yeah. And I think, of course, when we started talking about targets, there was a lot of positive, you will remember in the working group, a lot of positive kind of reactions in the sense that, yes, we need to be aligned with science-based targets. But of course, then you get into the discussions of what needs to be included and what is in scope and what is out scope. So the conversation becomes very technical. And sometimes not everybody is aware about those technicalities, right? So I think it will be important to continue to build that capacity going forward. But I think that generally speaking, the level of ambition is there, aligned with some of the best practice coalitions. For us, for Sports for Climate Action, it is fully aligned with Race to Zero criteria, which is why organizations that sign on to Sports for Climate Action and adopt those targets, they also become part of Race to Zero. But I think maybe just one thing to clarify in terms of the targets. So I think what we're saying is that organizations that sign up, they commit to achieving 50% reduction by 2030, net zero by 2040, write plans, and not just write them, but actually work to create those plans to identify what are some of the actions that they will be taking to achieve the 50% reduction by 2030. Yeah. And of course, as they develop those plans, they will come with opportunities. I am sure that will be the case, right? But at the same time, they will come with some challenges and dependencies, right? I can achieve this if this sector does this, or Absolutely. I can. So I think it's very important to get that intelligence and to understand. And of course, there's other challenges, right? Depending on where these signatories are in terms of geography and so on. But I think Sports for Climate Action needs to be seen as this platform that is ambitious, but at the same time, with the recognition that there will be challenges along the way. It will not be perfect, but we are kind of one team and we want to make it work together. And of course, each of us brings something to the table to kind of continue to build it and continue to refine it as much as possible.
Yeah. And we know that when we're going through these transition periods, the progress isn't linear in terms of as you said, the complexities there. And I was going to go on to ask you about challenges that you hear from signatories. And I think you've already touched on one there, and the elusive scope 3 conversation. But this is it. There's so much sport can do in terms of driving changes in that industry. But we also have to acknowledge that in terms of travel, etc., and some of the wider impacts of that there is complexities to that when you're relying on other systems decarbonising to be able to reach your goals. And we have to be able to have open conversations about that, where we can do the best that we can do. But the whole world is going through a transition around energy, around transport, around food, etc. And for a greater or lesser extent, sports organisations are in the mix with that, aren't they?
Absolutely. I mean, Claire, as you said, like every organization, every company, every industry will have unique challenges, but at the same time, they'll have unique opportunities when it comes to reducing their emissions. And I think in terms of, challenges a little bit more specifically, what we're seeing is sometimes there's this uncertainty about where to begin, uncertainty around how to build the business case. Sometimes they don't know where to get the data, right? Which is not just characteristics of sport. I think data is a big problem and big challenge everywhere. But I think a significant challenge is also sometimes support from appropriate stakeholders, right? Be they senior management or other people that are other sectors that are in that kind of space, in that arena, but also policy environments. And sometimes there's things like budgetary issues and so on. So challenges are multifold, I think. But these are not really reasons not to start doing something about it. I think that some solutions exist. We've seen, because some signatories are making good progress. And I know that there will be, of course, challenges and areas where sports organizations, and in particular those that are small, cannot control. But if we don't tackle scope 3 emissions, which is where the majority of impact lies, if we don't get an understanding of what that is, we can forget about collaboration with relevant stakeholders in this area, right? Because scope 1 and 2 is going to be very limited, very, very small. Of course, it's important, but it's not as big as scope 3 emissions. And I think if you do that properly and you get a good understanding of what those scope 3 emissions are, where are some of the areas that you can actually address yourself by either avoiding them or by maybe reducing them? If not, then rethink your partnerships. Rethink who you work with, who you buy services and goods from. Rethink about shipping equipment and stuff, and think about different ways. I mean, this is about innovation as well in many, many ways. We're not saying that sports need to, reduce their work program or become really small and not work with anybody. But I think there's lots of companies now that are trying to walk the talk. And of course, they too will depend from their partners. So it's really very much about focusing on that collaboration with your supply chain as much as possible, and driving and pushing each other and holding each other accountable for this to happen.
Yeah. And also, as you said, taking advantage of the opportunities in terms of, rather than see, we hear that from the organizations that are furthest ahead with this, they don't see themselves as a buyer-supplier relationship. They see partnerships with working towards the same goals and each playing a role in that. And I think through that, we see that a lot in sport in terms of especially sponsorships and brand alignment, etc., where if you're aligning with the right companies that have got the same ethos as you, by working together, we can move forward much more quickly. We can come up with new ideas and drive progress in that way. And that partnership element, I think, can't be underestimated.
Absolutely. And that's really, achieving net zero is not going to happen in isolation. So I think everybody needs to include the supply chain somehow in their processes through policies or contracts or whatever it is, right? And I think it's important to start with that as quickly as possible, because that way you influence what others do, but at the same time, you kind of are making some efforts to address that footprint. So definitely there's scope there. I'm not saying that scope 3 is easy. For many organizations, it can be a monster because, the data exists in different places and maybe not so accurate and so on. But I think the point is you need to start from somewhere. You need to start building that knowledge and knowing your numbers, and then trying to see how can you use those numbers to influence that systemic kind of that system around you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's so much there. And I think now the framework has over 270 signatories now, somewhere around that. So, and we're seeing that number growing as well, which is great. Again, showing the how seriously the industry has taken this. I think I've observed as well the seniority of people involved with this work comparative to where we began, etc. I think that everything's going in the right direction, although there's a lot more work to do, etc. I think things are progressing. But what's next in terms of your work at the Secretariat and supporting signatories and the progress now that targets are in place, now that reporting is mandatory for those who have taken the higher ambition track, etc. What's next for you in terms of what that looks like?
Thank you, Claire. Yes, and maybe if I can just go back to something you said before this question, to say, a lot of the growth in the framework, of course, was thanks to champions of Sports for Climate Action and yourself and a lot of other people who have continuously advocated for Sports for Climate Action. And to be honest, we don't see this as our UNFCCC thing. It's very much a sports thing, very much built by input from sports. And, we are all the time asking for comments and input to see how we can improve, how we can make it easier. But at the same time, with the recognition that we will not or cannot compromise on the level of ambition, because that's where we need to go, and it will be good. I mean, if done properly, every investment today will bring returns tomorrow, but we need to really be sitting down and thinking very holistically about these things. In terms of the next steps, of course, as you know very well, we have launched the targets at COP, and we have just launched also the reporting framework, just looking to find out some, progress in terms of how people have addressed goals of the framework, in what way they have measured, what kind of methodology, have their emissions increased or decreased over time, really trying to understand a little bit more about how they're approaching this climate neutrality or net zero plan. Looking at ways to identify where are some of the challenges, and in particular in scope 3, trying to understand whether we can take something from those challenges and build something, a way forward, or some sort of strategy for them to use in the coming years. But I think what I should say is that although there's still time to submit reports, I've seen a couple that have come our way, and they look really good. So it's pretty encouraging so far to see that organizations have already done the work. They've measured emissions, and they have a clear plan going forward. So that's great. And I think those are some examples that we want to be showcasing going forward, right? To really let people know, as that action is possible. And as you know, Claire, as well, we've talked many times about how can an organization take that leap of faith and just commit, and then start thinking about, okay, what do I need to do now? And I think that commitment, of course, is the first step. But now going forward, we need to really turn those commitments into actions as quickly as possible. There's only less than 8 years, right, to get to 2030. So we don't have a lot of time, but I think it's quite exciting, don't you think?
I think so. And also, I think I'm always fascinated when people chat to us about, organizations that are looking to join the framework and the conversations we have, because I think it's, a lot of the signatories, I think, haven't, they're moving towards it. But I think it's important that sports organizations understand that they don't have to have all the answers before they look to sign the framework and make that commitment. And actually, by having the commitment and the ambition and the buy-in to make that commitment, the rest will follow as well. And I know you do as well. And we hear that a lot of, we're not sure yet. We're doing so much in this area, and we're doing all these great things, but all this seems quite big, and we're not sure about that in case we can't follow through. And I guess the takeaway, isn't it, is like, if you commit to it, you're much more likely to follow through. And actually, again, if you extrapolate that to the furthest point, even if you try really hard and you on paper fail, you've done a whole lot more than if you haven't put yourself out to do that. And this, as well as what I struggle with in terms of, I understand big professional sports organizations and their brands, and they want to make sure if they commit to something, they can achieve it. But actually, what we're talking about here is so much bigger than that. It's about playing a contribution to combat the climate crisis, which, as we were talking about, whilst we have had to deal with other existential threats in our recent history, and at the moment, this bigger existential threat of climate change is hanging over us, and we have to make these commitments now and make this work. And as you said, it's exciting to think about what that could look like and where that can lead us to in sport as well. Absolutely. And I think, we said it many times, and I know that there will be people who may agree or not agree, but sports can do it. Yes. I mean, sports can really do this and set the pace and show people that this is possible much more, before than the others. And I think it's not just about what they have to do because of the climate and because they want to be seen as doing good, but it's about their businesses as well. I think
it's important to if sports want to stay relevant, for sure, as an organization and ultimately maybe as a business, they need to be looking into those things and starting to prepare to be more accurate and more advanced as we move on. But I think what is important and quite crucial is to start with action as quickly as possible. So you don't wait for your plans to be perfect. As you say, you have to make the commitment. You need to send that signal and to orient everything you have, the infrastructure and decisions you're making towards that public.
Yeah. And we see it with athletes, don't we? I mean, we know a lot of athletes, and I'm sure a lot of people listening to this know a lot of athletes. And when they think, I want to reach this goal, I want to reach an Olympic final, I want to achieve this in my career, they haven't extrapolated every single move to get there. They set an ambition, and then they set a plan, and they pivot that plan, and they change their strategy. But they always have that goal in mind at the end. And I think we can learn a lot from that as an industry as well, to follow that lead.
Absolutely.
I'm conscious of time and finishing up. But the last question I would ask for you, which is, one that maybe our listeners would be interested in from your perspective, is if you've got a piece of advice, or, you obviously are chatting to sports organizations a lot. You've been pushing this forward for so many years now, and is such a crucial part of the movement, even though I know you won't take credit for that, because that is the UN way. But you have been, and I'd love it just to finish off with, if you have a piece of advice for a sport organization or individual who's listening to this that's thinking, I should get started, or I need to increase my ambition, or whatever it is, what is the little nugget you would say to them?
Well, I mean, I think maybe just to start by saying nobody has all the answers. Nobody. Mm-hmm. So if you think that organizations that have set net zero plans, they know exactly what are they going to do, just let me tell you, they don't. Of course, there is a lot of work that's being done, and modeling and trying to understand, and, but there's dependencies, because we are living in a globalized world, right? And things are not the same everywhere. You have different conditions, you've got different tools and different technologies and different setups. When you look at Sports for Climate Action signatories, there too, you will see that you have signatories with different levels of maturity in climate or sustainability, with different levels of capacity as well, right, to address this. But I think the point is to be really kind of using that sports spirit, right, to be as fast as possible, but at the same time to help the team as much as possible to, with knowledge and with tools and so on. And I think we need to start thinking about how do we shape this kind of whole journey going forward in the next 2-3 years. And I think that we're waiting very much from a lot of our signatories to give us that feedback and give us some of the lessons that they've learned. But yes, there's no reason, if you're a sports organization, not to sign the framework. It is not that difficult to sign it, but of course, that's not going to be it. That is where it starts. And of course, there's some guidance out there, and there's some guidance that we have also prepared that can help you move forward. But I think if you haven't started, please do so as quickly as possible. The time is now.
The time is now. And also you are joining an incredible community of global sports organizations that are doing the same thing as you. So that is part of it as well, isn't it? People can join, and then they're not alone on this journey. They may be the only person inside their organization who's responsible for it or needs to be. But by joining the framework, I think you're connecting with this incredible group of people, individuals and organizations who are leading the way on this. So yes, the time is now. That's the message.
Absolutely.
Well, listen, thank you for taking the time to join us today. It's been incredible to hear from you. That was Lindita Xhaferi-Salihu, Sectors Engagement Lead at UNFCCC.
Thank you so much, Claire. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. You too. Thanks for listening to the Climate of Sport podcast. Please like and subscribe, and get in touch if you want to share information about the work that you're doing, if you want to appear as a guest, or you want to recommend guests, or you just have ideas of conversations you'd like us to have. You can get in touch by emailing info@sportpositivesummit.com.